best announcement that I ever had. But I think that was the nice part of this evening, because the rest of the evening we will talk about trauma, and trauma matters. And, well, that's not a very uplifting topic, of course. So as you can see here, the word trauma is derived from a really piercing in the skin, so a physical trauma. And it's only in the 19th century that it was also used as more psychic trauma. And as we are here together, most of us will have some sort of wounds. It may be one wound, a small wound, a bigger wound. Some have several. Some may be just scars, others may be more open, even a bit infected. But that is what life is. So trauma matters in that sense. And particularly in the nowadays, with the war ongoing, with the earthquakes in Turkey, the school bombings, there are so many traumatic events. And even a week ago, the Volkskrant headlined that even 1 of the 10 students in the Netherlands is assaulted. So it is not just something from the past, it is not something from elsewhere, but traumatic events are still quite common. And so my research is aimed to understand how people respond to trauma, what are good ways, what are efficient ways to cope with trauma, and also how we can foster resilience. And also how people transmit trauma, how parents transmit it, for example, to the next generation. And so I really enjoyed doing this research, even though it's such a hard topic. I did it with a lot of PhD students, and I like to share some of the insights we gathered in these years. And so if you mostly came for the band or for the cocktails, here is the brief take-home message. You can leave now. There are some good news and some bad news. And the good news is that, in essence, our brains are really wired to cope perfectly well with stress and trauma. And I will tell a bit more later about that. But while the brain is, in general, a really good ally, when you're exposed to these traumatic events in childhood, then the brain may really eventually turn into sort of an enemy. It will work against you, and I will also explain that a bit more. And one of the surprising lessons I learned from the research we did is that it's maybe not the most obvious objective traumatic events that have the biggest impact, but that it's also particularly neglect, not being seen, that we realized has a really major impact on people that may stay for life. And that is something that is neglected in society, and often also by clinicians and by people themselves. So that's what I'd like to talk a bit more about today as well. And then finish with the good news is that, so if neglect is one of these impactful negative events, that our presence is one of the good ingredients for a resilient brain. So it's good to be here together. So to understand more about the brain, I really like to focus on it from an evolutionary perspective. That really helped me to understand how the impact is of stress and trauma on the brain. And so the first major function of the brain is to survive under stressful circumstances. If you think about everything that humans have been through, we have been fighting with wolves, or have all these natural disasters, major wars. So if the brain would not be perfectly fit to react immediately, to fight, to be very efficient in these stressful conditions, we wouldn't have survived. So that is actually the first main aim, priority number one of the brain. And there are two stress systems. For whom is this familiar? Yeah, okay, good. Because indeed this is quite basic, the two very basic stress systems. So if we would hear here now a very loud noise, something going on here, then immediately the sympathetic nervous system would be activated. And our heart would be racing, we would feel it beating, we may sweat, and this would prepare us really to run and very quick and leave the room. And adrenaline will be released in the body, and this makes it possible that we can also memorize this very well, and specifically, for example, the sounds and everything that you found threatening at that moment. And then after a while, a second stress system kicks in of the HPA axis, and after 20 minutes or so, the stress hormone cortisol is released. And it's a very intricate balance, because the cortisol brings down the first activation of the stress system. So in a way, it calms you down. And after a while, when there's enough cortisol in the system, also the second system is quieted. And of course, that's very important, because you probably all know that being in this very stressed state costs enormous amount of energy, and eventually it will also impact your immune system. So this works pretty well. And now these two systems have in itself, they of course talk to the brain. You may know the brain. If you have fist like this, it is all just this size. It weighs about 1.5 kilos. And it is the most complex system I think we have. So there have been these parallels with the Amazon. And in the brain, there are just as many trees as there are in the Amazon. So it's about 100 billion neurons that make up our brain and that are responsible for all the messages that are sent all the time. And actually the messages are sent by the connections. And there have been calculations that as many leaves there are in the Amazon, that's how many connections we have in the brain. So it's a sort of a dazzling, enormous complexity. Now, what happens if we are in this state of acute stress is that there is one system in the brain that's called the salience network that is activated. And when that is activated, we become very hyper-vigilant. We see everything. Our senses become more sensitive. And this is this is referred to as the amygdala, as the brain structure, or actually two brain structures, one on each side. That is very much known also by therapists. But actually it's more like a network where there's also the insula and other parts of the brain. So this is activated, and it's not just activated, but also the connection in this network is more strong when we are in this state of arousal. And there's a really nice balance. So if the adrenaline is activated, that is what activates this fear system, this salience network. And then what cortisol does is actually dampen the activation in that system. Now, this sort of explains when we are exposed to really traumatic, very impactful events. So this is a picture of the Bataclan, where the shootings were in Paris. And, well, you can imagine if you have been there that stress reactions are enormous. People were very much afraid, also angry, lots of emotions. And also the days after, people have like these recurrent images of what happened all the time. And that is because of the adrenaline that was released. People may tend to avoid the reminders, not wanting to talk about it, be irritable. And some people are just numb. They don't feel anything anymore. And of course, that is completely normal. But surprisingly, this system works really well. And one of the things I was really fascinated about is that actually the majority of people, even after these very frightening, threatening events where your life is really at stake, that the majority of people can cope really well. And this is not related to the objective severity of the event, what makes such an impact. So even like veterans in war situations or with natural disasters, for example, with the earthquake, the majority of people, after a while, the symptoms go down and people are able to cope and carry on with their lives. So that's actually about 60, 75, 80% of the time people are able to do that. And then there's a smaller group, and there they do have symptoms and feel really have these flashbacks all the time. They remain very fearful or irritated, and with every sound they may become easily aroused. So this, for some people, these type of events have a major impact. And so the main question in this field is to understand what makes people cope so well, but especially also what is going on, what doesn't work in the group that has developed these trauma symptoms for a longer period of time. And we've learned that, of course, your genes, your makeup, your character makes a lot of difference. We also have learned that social support makes a big difference. And we've also learned that the group with a lot of stress, even for the long time, that is related to whether or not they have been what they have experienced in their childhood. And that is actually most the focus of my work, is to investigate what the impact is of traumatic experience in childhood. And unfortunately, also, these events are not rare, even in the Netherlands. So when we talk about traumatic events in childhood, we often make a distinction in abusive events where children are exposed to physical abuse, and also emotional abuse. And that's actually the most current exposure to trauma, is where parents are really critical, belittling a child, calling a child names, and that is what we call, if that's a sort of a chronic situation, and we call it emotional abuse. And then, of course, there's also sexual abuse that can happen in the family or outside. And these events, there has been quite some research that in every class there's about 1 out of 30 children, so in every class 1 child who experiences these type of experiences, and often this is not seen. And on the other hand, there is neglect. I referred to it already in the beginning. And that is really a different type of very stressful events, where actually parents don't do something actively, but actually the needs of the child for being seen, being heard, being consoled when a child is sad, for example, when those are not met. And the child really doesn't have the feeling that parents love the child for example. So that's what we call emotional neglect. And these two, that is has been one of the focuses of my research. And now, how we can understand what the impact is when these traumatic events occur in childhood is because of another aspect of the brain, and that it really wants to understand and predict the future. Because that makes sense, of course. If you have a brain that can predict how things will be in the future, you know that what are the situations that are frightening, for example, that are threatening, then you can avoid it. If you know that a parent, if he frowns, that you better get away, then that's helpful to prevent these type of events. So it has been stated that the brain is a sort of an anticipation machine. And making future is the most important thing it does. So we anticipate all the time of what may happen, and if that fits, then we have an advantage for that. And we use, of course, the information about our past. So when you grow up in a situation that is very threatening, and where you feel unsafe all the time, this is also what you may project to the future when you interact with colleagues, for example, with friends, with a loved one. And so every time there is a frown or there is something negative, the system anticipates on like a negative interaction, whereas maybe this is not the intention of the person you are with. And so we do a lot of brain research, and this is what we also have literally observed in the scanner. So we investigate adults in the scanner. We show them, for example, pictures of faces. And this was a group of people, adults in their 40s, even 50s. And we were just exposing them to pictures with all kinds of expressions. And now adults who reported that as a child they had been exposed to or were growing up with parents that were very critical and often also neglectful, because these are often occur together. We saw that this salience network, and especially the amygdala, but also other regions, that they were more reactive to these phases. So even with these sort of subtle threats, it is hardly a threat, it's just a face that's looking at you, the alarm system is already on. And this is 25 years later. They're not living with the parents anymore, but still it looks like the brain is a sort of programmed and it's more sensitive. So this may explain why particularly these traumatic events in childhood are such a risk factor for later mental problems. Now, this is not the whole story. I hope you can still bear it. We're not with the good part yet. Because another important factor of the brain is that it is really wired to facilitate attachment. So imagine as a parent, you don't have anything, there's no attachment system, and there's a baby, and the baby is crying, and you are sort of tired. And if there wouldn't be something in you that is activated to take care of the baby, you would maybe just ignore the baby. If you are hungry, or you like to go out, or it costs a lot of it. And maybe people who know with children, it really, if you're totally tired, then sometimes it costs a lot of energy to take care of a baby. But we do that most of the time. And that is because of this system that is wired in our brains, and we really share that with all the other species. And this is really fascinating how that works. At so many levels, this is programmed in our brain that we do this. And just an example is that, for example, we have neurons also on our skin, and some of these respond particularly to touch. So there are many that signal just if something is hot or cold, and then it's quickly so that we can go away from the hot or the cold. But there are other neurons, and they respond just to touch. And they have a direct connection to the brain. And so if there's a gentle touch with a good temperature, then it signals to the brain and the sympathetic nervous system, so the system that is activated during stress, calms down through that. So that's really nice, and that is something that is shared with all kinds of species. And this is something that needs to be programmed. So here you see how that actually may have an impact on that threat system. So here is you see at the right this what they call soothing system. And if we as children, as babies, as children are soothed, first that is on a very physical level, but later also parents can be soothing just in words because they listen to a child, that this calms down the stress system. And once a child has learned that through the parents, it is also able to regulate their emotions on their own, or for example with a friend or with a partner. And this is a very, very important system that can regulate the stress. So now what we see in children who are exposed to these traumatic events in childhood is that on the one hand this threat system is very easily activated, what we saw with the amygdala, even with like minor stressors, if there's criticism or if there's something negative, this may be activated very easily. But on the other hand, they don't have the capacity to regulate these emotions as people would do who have been really growing up in a very safe and loving environment. So that is actually what I mean with the brain is the worst enemy after growing up in very threatening circumstances in childhood, because on the one hand the brain is programmed to be hypersensitive to threats, and on the other hand there is this soothing system that is not well developed. And this is a really toxic combination where it is really difficult to regulate the emotions. And also to benefit from social support, from friends, from a partner, or even from a therapist. If that system is not really developed, it's really hard to also have the social support and profit from it. So if you see this, then it's not very surprisingly that if we look at the mental disorders, there are many, unfortunately, that these type of experiences explain really a large proportion of the mental disorders that there are. So it is there, of course, genes play a very important role, but also these childhood events also explain about 30% of all the adult mental health. So this is something that is really has an impact, for life. And it is particularly what we found in several studies in large groups. What was striking to me, that it is not these objective harmful experiences like physical abuse, but it is even more these more subtle, so-called subtle experiences, the emotional abuse and the emotional neglect that played a very large role. And if you look at the level of symptoms and not so much in terms of disorders, you can almost see these different systems. So on the one hand, after trauma, after these sort of traumatic events, people can be, for example, anxious, have nightmares, but be hyper alert, have flashbacks, be easily started. And that is something that may be related to this fear system that is activated. And then on the other hand, and that's in red, people really have difficulties with coping with the emotions. And they resort in all kinds of unhealthy coping, such as eating problems or addiction, drugs and alcohol, or don't have other means than thinking about the death as the ultimate way to get out, or harming themselves. So these are more the ways to cope with these very heavy negative emotions. So then the question is, how can we treat the consequences of these experiences? And fortunately, there has been a lot of research on that. And we know that exposure therapy, so go back, think about these events. So people really try to avoid these painful memories, but the exposure therapy, whether it is, and there are many versions, prolonged exposure, EMDR, you may have heard about it, virtual reality, but there is a sort of a common theme, and that is that what is usually avoided, these negative memories, that they are re-experienced again. And that there's also some processing of the cognition. So what was the meaning actually? And does it say anything about you, how your parents, for example, were behaving? Or are there alternative explanations? For example, that parents had their own problems, but that you were just a good kid. And that works. But it doesn't work for everybody. It is like for all these types of therapies, we know that about 50% of the patients, we have something here to brighten things up. Cheers. We can use that. Oh, that's dangerous with the laptop. Yeah, so, well, the good news is then that like 50% profits from it, get really better from these type of therapies. But there's also a high group, yeah, it's about 30% of the people that start these type of therapies but drop out. So that and that is understandable because it is painful, of course, to go back to these memories and re-experience them. And then there's also a substantial portion of people that still have symptoms even after these exposure therapies. And my idea is that one of the reasons maybe that there is some, it works a bit, is that they all focused on this threat system. The exposure is all about trying to normalize the threat system, but that really there's not been a lot of focus on the so-called soothing system. So they are now starting to think about how can we also foster more this feeling that people are feeling safe. For example, when children are doing the exposure therapy, to also engage really the parents and have them also talk about what parents can do when the child comes home, for example. But also for adults, I think it would be really important that there's more safety around these type of exposures. For example, that parents of partners or other people are really involved in the therapy, and maybe also with peers, and see if we can reduce the dropout by these type of therapies. Yes, and then you can wonder how is a parent if you have a brain that is so easily activated, stressed, when there is something negative? I mean, children can be mean sometimes. And what's happening if like a parent has such a reactive brain and is not able to soothe him or herself? So how do people react to their own children? And this was one of the questions that we investigated in a huge study at Leiden University. It was a sort of a nightmare study, because we wanted to have 3 generations and investigate, so what are the mechanisms of people who have been growing up with trauma in their childhood. How many of these people do also transmit it to the next generation and be abusive parents or neglectful parents themselves? Cheers. So, for me, it was a really interesting study, and because the perspective of always working with people who are victims of these kind of experiences, where the parents are like the perpetrators, so to speak, that is really turns around when you investigate these families, because at a certain level, a parent is the child and a sort of more of the victim, but on the other hand, when this behavior is transmitted, it is also like a perpetrator. So this black and white idea of good and bad is suddenly very different if you focus on families. And it's also very important, of course, for prevention, because if we know the mechanisms, how this is transmitted to the next generation, we are also able maybe to intervene at that point. So this was like a huge endeavor. We invited many families to Leiden, and actually we were surprised, but families were also willing to come and have discussions together, and went into the scanner. And what we learned there is that about 1 out of 3 parents who had themselves a history of abuse growing up with, particularly emotional abuse again, and neglect, they were also abusive as parents. So the good news is that 2 out of 3 of these parents are really able to transform it and to be good parents. So that's really the good news. But we saw in general that people with parents with a history of abuse, that when they were talking to their children, so we had that videotaped and we investigated how their talk was, and that they were more critical towards the child. And then we saw a bit of a different pattern for parents who were neglected as a child, or at least who experienced that as a child. And one of the interesting findings we found is when they were in a scanner and they were playing a very simple game. So the person in the scanner is the one with the hands, is looking at a ball game. And in the beginning, the person in the scanner is just also tossing the ball to others. But at a certain point, the ball is just tossed between the two, and the participant doesn't get the ball anymore. And it is just a very tiny example, but people do feel a little bit of being left out, being socially excluded. And that's also what we see in the brain, a sort of a stress response to social exclusion. And what was interesting, also here we saw that people who felt that they had been neglected as a child, that parents didn't give the feeling that they were loved, that they had this response far more intense. So we could see that again in this threat system. And these parents were also, when they were in a conflict task, or they were talking with their child about, well, they had to choose between sort of all the conflicts at home, that they were also more aroused, that their heart rate was higher. So these were all, referring to that they couldn't regulate their stress response. So altogether, these parents were also more likely to have feelings of depression and also other type of psychopathology, and also we know that this is also an increased risk for the children. So then the question is, of course, so how can we prevent this cycle? So what I already told, it's 2 out of 3 parents are able to prevent this cycle, and we've learned also about them. So how can we boost resilience also in children, so that when they are exposed to stressful or even traumatic experiences, that they can regulate their responses better. And so, yeah, if we go back to this same overview, then parents can do actually 2 things. And in the first place, that is what I learned, is that it is really important to foster the soothing system. And there's many research showing that, like a warm family climate where parents are more empathic, more supportive, where there's also like physical contact, if that's okay for the child, of course, but if it just... and also parents who care for themselves, that if there are symptoms of depression or other mental problems, that they seek help, but also look for other like support in the family, for example, if they have difficulties. That all really helps to strengthen that soothing system in children, and that helps them to regulate their own responses. And of course, the other is more to reduce the threats. So of course, to minimize criticism, but also acknowledge all the feelings of children. And what is also important, to stimulate exposure. So stimulate exploring emotions rather than avoiding emotions. And if you would translate this to an even larger scale, of course, ultimately, you also want to have a resilient society. And this is something, where we have like a limited impact, but I think this is something that on one hand we do very well in the Netherlands. So what we do very well is that we have very high quality trauma facilities, for example, all throughout the Netherlands. For example, the Center for Sexual Abuse, where everyone is really helped very effectively, and then treatment is really good. There's a lot of good education on trauma at the universities, for example. The Netherlands is actually is a really high standard. But we can also provide this even more for teachers, for example, and also for parents. Now, the part where I think we can really do much better in this country is to create more safety. And so we've seen that that is so important. So think about reducing loneliness, create safe places for traumatized individuals. We have a terrible situation, foster care children, for example, or if you see how refugees who were so traumatized are now taken care of, it is just, this creates really much more trauma than there is already. And this ultimately will also have its consequences with even more aggression in our society. And the other thing is what I think we can do much better is also to provide support for parents so that they know much better what is good to, especially when there are really challenging situations, when a child has, for example, mental health problems, how they can cope with that. So that is back to where we started. And so the essence is indeed that for the majority of people, the brain is really very well wired to cope with trauma, but there are these circumstances where we become very sensitive, and it is really difficult, and these people need more support. And the take-home message, maybe what we all can do, is that just mere presence is an ingredient where we can really support the resilience of other brains. People, your friends, your family, your children, your partner, just acknowledge and listen, and that is a really powerful tool. So maybe with a drink you can start there. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.